as today is World Suicide Prevention Day, I'm here to talk about the relationship between suicide prevention and what is called physician-assisted suicide, really in terms of what are the impacts, what is the impact of legalizing assisted dying or physician-assisted suicide, medically assisted dying on the rates of people who take their own lives and the rates of people who die by non-assisted suicide. Though the focus will more be on suicide than on euthanasia. There's a relationship between euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, but we're going to focus on assisted suicide rather than euthanasia. Basically, there are going to be my talk, and then Professor David Paton is going to talk, and then we're going to show an interview between Professor Patricia Casey and Professor Anne Doherty. I have written peer-reviewed journal, article both with David and with Anne, and in both cases, I asked the question and they gave the answers. And that's basically also what I'm going to do today. I'm going to set up the question and show why it's significant, and we're going to hear some of the evidence from both from a statistical and from a clinical point of view. So aware of our time, I'll move on. It's become common for people who are in favour of physician-assisted suicide no longer to accept the language of assisted suicide. The language of assisted suicide has become controversial, and it's sometimes said that this language is inaccurate and is question-begging, and that it's only used by people who are opposed to the practice. So this is question-begging language, which is language which comes from or is only used by those who are opposed to the practice. I don't want to focus too much on language because a rose by any other name would smell as sweet or smell rather off if we're talking about unsavory practices. But language can help us to clarify things. So and because it's become controversial, I think it's useful to remind ourselves of the history. So of those jurisdictions which currently permit some form of what is called assisted dying, that is assisted suicide or euthanasia, the very first, passed a bill specifically for this purpose was the state of Oregon in the United States. This bill was called the Death with Dignity Act and didn't use the language of physician-assisted suicide, but the first report, as required by the law, began with the sentence, on October 27th, 1997, physician-assisted suicide became a legal medical option for terminally ill Oregonians. So that was the very first sentence of the very first report, official report as required by law into the Death with Dignity Act. And the phrase physician-assisted suicide was also used in the very first sentence of the second report, and of the third report, and of the fourth report, and of the fifth report, up until 2007, when this language was dropped by the Oregon government, and it was described in other ways. The practice did not change at all. Eligibility criteria didn't change at all. We know that this didn't reflect any actual change in practice, but this language became one which was less commonly used. The second state to pass, which still has a law, to pass a law which allowed physician-assisted suicide for that purpose was the Netherlands. Their law was called the Termination of Life on Request and Assisted Suicide Reviews Procedure Act. Netherlands, April 1st, 2002. It was passed in 2001, came into force 2002. This was used as the model for Luxembourg for its law on euthanasia and assisted suicide, 2009. In Switzerland, which is the country we probably associate most with assisted dying in this country because of the activities of Dignitas, there wasn't a law passed for this purpose. It was just a law allowed assisted suicide for non-selfish reason, and then much later, decades later, organisations grew up in that legal space, as it were, to offer an organised form of assisted suicide. So it wasn't there wasn't a specific law at a specific time, as it were, and because of that, there's no statutory reporting requirement for that kind of thing. So that even though organised forms of assisted suicide in Switzerland begin in the 1980s, and they ramp up in a particular way after 1998, when Dignitas is formed and they start to categorise things differently, the first government report into assisted suicide wasn't until 2012. And it's called Causes of Death Statistics 2009, Assisted Suicide and Suicide in Switzerland, Federal Statistics Office 2012. So it's very clear that the ordinary language of those jurisdictions which first brought in assisted suicide in the United States, in the Netherlands, in Luxembourg, in Switzerland, was for assisted suicide. So it wasn't simply language by those who were opposed to it. And indeed, even as recently as 2013, a bill which was defeated in 2015, while in England they were debating the assisted dying bill, actually the assisted dying #2 bill in 2015. In Scotland, they were debating the assisted suicide Scotland bill. So Margaret MacDonald, who was a very strong proponent of this legislation, was quite content with the language of assisted suicide. So even though it is controversial, it has only recently become controversial, and I think it's at least reasonable to draw upon that language. So why is it interesting to draw upon that language? I think it's because the language of assisted suicide immediately shows up the tension between assisted suicide and suicide prevention. According to the World Health Organization, in its report, Preventing Suicide, a Global Imperative, every suicide is a tragedy. This is a phrase which is used very often in the suicide prevention literature. Every suicide is a tragedy. Every death robs the world of someone who is unique and irreplaceable, a world unto themselves, and every death is a loss. But death by one's own hand is a tragedy in a greater sense because this is not necessary. It's not something that we necessarily have to accept, as we have to accept death. Death is always a loss, but we have to accept that we will die. But we don't have to accept that we will die by our own hands, and it is preventable often that someone dies by their own hands. Much of what is going to be said by others will be about statistics, and this is important because even though statistics are rather dry and abstract, they help to us to assess the consequences of our actions, especially the consequences of political actions. But it is important at the same time to keep in mind that every death, every premature death, cuts life short, is a person with a story and with loved ones. And I'm concerned about this issue because I have known people who have died by their own hand, and I have known people who have seriously contemplated doing so but have come through that. And it is for such reasons that, that I am engaged in this, even though it's also true that you can look at the statistics of that, and I think statistics of that are something which is important. So if we care about preventing suicide, and if we care about every person, whether they're young or whether they're old, whether they're physically healthy or whether they're physically sick, whether they're chronically sick, whether they're terminally ill, if we care about each person, then there is a problem with saying certain categories of people, we will say we will facilitate their assisted suicide. So that's a reason why many people, including myself, are concerned about this kind of legislation. So that's a sort of an argument on one side. It would seem that promoting or assisting suicide is intentional suicide prevention. It has been argued, however, and this is sort of argument I want to set up, that however paradoxical it may seem, legalization of assisted suicide may help with suicide prevention. And the reason for this, basically, is that some people who would be eligible for assisted suicide currently die by suicide. There are people who are terminally ill who currently die by suicide. And maybe if assisted suicide was an option, that might happen less. And so Matt Hancock asked the Office of National Statistics to look into this, and they said they found that patients with some serious condition, life-threatening conditions, were twice as likely as the general population to kill themselves. And according to this finding, in responding to this finding, it was said, quote, "This illustrates the danger of the country's ban on assisted dying, and as to growing evidence that the laws need to change." This was a statement by Jackie Davis of Healthcare Professionals for Assisted Dying, so somebody who's in favour of assisted dying. But the argument is that the ban on assisted dying is dangerous because it leads people to end their life because they don't feel that this is an option. And so if this argument is sound, then it would seem that if you make assisted dying available, then you will reduce the number of non-assisted suicides. And indeed, perhaps reduce them quite a lot, because we're talking about maybe 10% of the population of the people who kill themselves are people with very serious diseases. So not just a small. But we can go further than that, or people have gone further than that with this kind of argument. The organisation Exit, which is the first assisted suicide organisation in Switzerland, argues that Exit's option of physician-assisted suicide, that's the language that they use in Switzerland, Exit's option of physician-assisted suicide is actually an effective form of suicide prevention, because living in the certain knowledge of a way out has motivated more than half of the people originally intent on dying to keep enduring their painful lot until they pass away in the natural way, unquote. The argument being that what's helpful for suicide prevention is the security of knowing you have an option. But if you have the security of knowing you have an option, you don't necessarily take it. And in the experience of Exit and Dignitas, most people don't take it. So maybe you could prevent the suicides without having the assisted suicides. Because you could prevent the suicides because people would have the security, but they wouldn't necessarily go on to have physician-assisted suicide. And if this were the case, as Exit argues that it's the case, and Dignitas argues that it's the case, then what you would find is that legal availability of assisted dying would reduce the overall numbers of people who ended their life either by suicide or by assisted suicide. Those numbers would actually be reduced, not increased, by this legal change. This is a serious issue. It's essentially an empirical question. It's essentially an empirical question. Does legalizing assisted suicide have any effect on suicide rates? And if it does, is it a beneficial effect? Does it help to reduce rates because people have the security? Or is it a harmful effect? It normalizes suicide. And that's an empirical question. And we might have instincts about this, but we don't know until we look. And if we look, will we find that there is evidence of a reduction in overall deaths, in overall self-inflicted deaths? Will we find a reduction in non-assisted suicides at least? Or will we find evidence of an increase in self-inflicted death? Or would we find evidence of an increase even in non-assisted suicides? These are empirical questions. And if there is an increase, either in self-inflicted death or in non-assisted suicide, does it affect some groups more than others? These again are empirical questions. And before turning to the people who will help answer those questions, I would just like to reiterate what a number of people have said. Suicide is a tragedy. Every suicide is a tragedy, but there is help that is out there. Death is inevitable, but suicide is not inevitable. Thank you very much, and I'll turn to David to answer these questions that I have put before you.